Good day, Industrial Advisors listeners, and thank you for tuning in. If you have not subscribed, please do so by clicking subscribe wherever you podcast. Click the like button and hit the bell if you want notifications of when we put up new content. Leave us a comment about anything we discuss here today or general comments about the show. Now, let's get into it. Welcome to the Industrial Advisors Podcast. I'm Matt McGregor here with Bill Condon. We are live in Detroit, and we've got some special guests. We actually just finished a corporate-only session with our guests, Jason Miller and Bret Swango. Take a moment and introduce them. Bret leads our location intelligence and workforce analytical team here at Colliers International. Bret is an amazing, innovative person. He actually won the 2021 Innovation Award at Colliers. He's recognized by Icon as a top 10 global analytical professional. Jason Miller, a PhD, is the interim chairperson for the Department of Supply Chain at Michigan State University. Go Green. By the way, Michigan State University is the #1 supply chain program in the United States. Jason is a data junkie and data genius. Bill and I met Jason while taking his course at our master's degree at Michigan State. Jason has been quoted in over 200 media outlets, including the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, the Washington Post, NBC, and CBS News, and FreightWaves, to name a few. Welcome, gentlemen.
Appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Great to have you guys. By the way, Bret, I feel like you get like a really cool new title every 60 or 90 days or so. So congrats on your latest.
I think he just makes them up.
Yeah. When they want to pay you more, they just give you more words.
I can't spell some of those words.
That's right. Well, thank you, gentlemen. We actually brought these guys together to make us look really smart in front of a lot of corporates, and they did that, so I appreciate it, gentlemen. It was a fascinating segment. But part of this podcast, we will attach some of their slides that were the most unique. But let's get rolling and talk. Bill, this is your question here. Why don't you kick us off?
Well, yeah. So Bret and I were at a cocktail event at our national conference, and we started talking about analytics and how they've changed professional sports, how they've changed the way NBA players play, and how three-pointers are, a much bigger part of today's game than they used to be. Strategy, analytics, and MLB baseball. So my question for you, Bret, is how do NBA three-pointers, NFL championships, and Moneyball, what do those have to do with commercial real estate and labor?
Yeah, so I gave this example in our prior discussion, but I think the feedback loop that you get from the athletic arena is so quick, right? I mean, it's on every game. Hey, did we go in and do what we planned to do, and did it work better than what our opponent was doing? So I think there and/or like financial markets, you can look to both of those areas versus our world where, it might take, it's a 2 to 4 year process to know if a project was truly a success. So going to those areas where you get quicker feedback and looking at the way that analytics have transformed the decision-making process with things like the three-pointer. So the story that I'll tell there is like the Daryl Morey story with the Houston Rockets. So he was GM there from 2007 to 2020. Never played basketball, no background in basketball other than, he was an analytics guy from MIT, saw an opportunity where, it was really just an expected value calculation, right? If you're making 40% of your threes and 50% of your twos, 3 times 0.4 equals an expected value of 1.2 versus 2 times 0.5, an expected value of 1. So you got basically a 20% alpha on each three-pointer that you're attempting, assuming that you're shooting kind of right around that league average. And he took that mantra into the Houston Rockets, and they were the second winningest franchise in his 13-year tenure and most quantitatively the most efficient offense in NBA history. And they were shooting about 30 to 50% more than the rest of the league. Well, when he got there, the league wasn't even shooting 20% of the shots in games weren't three-pointers. Fast forward to today, it's 40%. And he was always, 5 to 10 years ahead of basically where the league eventually got to because he saw those analytical insights. And that's kind of the same story with the 2-point conversion and Doug Peterson and Paul Paganetti is the guy's name who was the analytics kind of guru that he leaned on from Penn. And he really got Peterson in this mindset of, hey, we should call plays based on expected points out, expected points added, and win probability versus just kind of the, I'll call it historical consensus given the down and distance. And in 2017, when they won the Super Bowl with a backup quarterback, Doug Peterson was quantitatively the most aggressive coach in NFL history. I think, and don't quote me on the well, these are pretty close. I think they went for it 75% more than the league average on fourth down, and they went for two twice as frequently. Well, fast forward 4 years, and those numbers are now both about the league average.
Yeah, the standard.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's just like these groups, if you can use data to identify these, I'll call it market inefficiencies, and then be an early adopter, ultimately everybody's going to get there eventually because that's evolution. But those who move first are going to have that advantage.
Yeah. No, I think it was a great example.
And Jason, I know that in the last downturn, there was a lot of issues with consumer debt. Where are we with that, and what's the financial position right now of the consumer kind of, arguably going into a downturn here?
Yeah, so we're seeing a very different situation today than in, let's say, 2007. Mortgage delinquency rates are actually right now lower today than they were in 2019. Credit card debt per account, which tends to be very correlated with economic conditions sort of inversely. So we saw that go up very sharply during the Great Recession. We actually have credit card debt today per account below where it was in 2019. It's very consistent with what we're hearing from Bank of America and American Express when they're not having any issues right now with elevated delinquency rates. Consumers, the spending is still staying strong. Even adjusted for inflation, retail sales are flat year over year, but they're about 6% above where the pre-COVID trend line would have placed us today. So we're still buying a lot of stuff, and we're still buying a lot of motor vehicles. Inventories to sales for car dealerships are still about 1.5. Is that ratio? Compare that to before COVID, it'd be about 2.2.
Mm-hmm.
So we're still seeing, very robust demand overall.
That's really shocking that the consumer debt isn't higher than what it was in 2007, 2008, just because everything's more expensive. I mean, you talk about cars, like if you can get one, right, you're paying so much more. And then during COVID, it seemed like everybody's buying Pelotons and redoing their houses and, buying huge TVs. What do you attribute that to? How are we not more in debt?
Stimulus.
Stimulus. Okay.
Yeah. When you look, there's just no economic precedent for the type of stimulus that went through originally with the CARES Act in April of 2020. And then with the January 2021 stimulus, but especially the March 2021 stimulus, there's just no precedence for this in history. And so I think that's where it's difficult right now to work out of we've had this incredible increase in, monies available to the American public, but at the same time, we have the highest inflation in 40 years. And that's where I think that there's a lot of disconnect, that if you focus just on the inflation, the intuition would be spending would be down tremendously. But I think as Bret was, talking about during our session about, you have to look at supply and demand for the warehouse labor discussion. We have to look at, inflation versus, accumulated monies and higher wages for this consumer spending discussion.
Yeah, that's a really interesting take. And it'll be interesting to see how that carries forward into 2023. I was at a buddy's house for dinner on Saturday night. We were over there, and he runs a company, manufacturing company in Seattle. And I asked him how labor was for him. Fascinating dinner conversation, I'm sure. But he said,
I'm sure your wife was really excited about that conversation.
Like, what are you? A couple glasses deep. Anyway, so he said that he thinks his company could have done probably 20 or 30% more business if they were able to just hire people, and labor is they're certainly their number one issue. Bret, you're talking to a lot of occupiers, on a daily basis. What are you hearing from them about kind of their biggest struggles? I imagine you're going to say it's labor.
Yeah, I think, there's the anecdotal piece is great, obviously, what you're hearing on a conversation by conversation basis. But I go to the Deloitte and Fortune do a survey of CEOs twice a year. And so I kind of go to that as kind of my, it's the biggest one I know of, hey, what do CEOs care about? Because if that's what they care about, if I'm trying to serve those organizations, that's obviously what I should care about. And they say it's supply chain, it's labor, and it's inflation.
Yeah.
And then I'll call it geopolitical risk. Those are kind of the big four. So then the first place my mind goes is, how do you start addressing those with your real estate? Or, you know, how can you address those and or mitigate those risks, leveraging your real estate portfolio? And that's where the location component obviously comes in critical on the labor side. And then I would say the other one that's kind of an interesting data point relative to 2019 is the criticality of like understanding an area's political affiliation. That is something that, and for most of our site selection projects, it would, you know, I mean, it came up maybe in 1 in 4, 1 in 5 conversations in 2019. And today it comes up in almost every major, you know, whether it's a HQ, whether it's a large manufacturing facility, you know, distribution's a little different. It's kind of like, hey, we have to be there.
Sure.
So it kind of almost is what it is. But yeah, political affiliation's a big deal. And then, and the other one I'd say is, you know, the latest survey results, it was all about uncertainty, right? Well, how do you solve for uncertainty? It's you get better information. And I think that's the exciting thing about this time, is that the value of information when you're in disproportionately volatile times is never higher. When things are kind of up and to the right, you know, the incremental value of better information is not as high as it is when you're in times like today when volatility is king.
Yeah.
You mentioned, Bret, in our session just now, a fascinating statistic about gas prices related with rent. Can you go over that?
Yeah. So we looked at historical gas prices going back to like roughly year 2000, and I just took the average price of a gallon of gasoline from 2015 to 2020, kind of, you know, just as a proxy of, hey, what was kind of the average operating environment pre-COVID. And then I looked at it. I think the number I had in there was I pulled that in September, I believe. So it was like $3.93. So it basically went from $2.43 to $3.93. So up $1.50. One of my buddies operates, it's a 9-figure 3PL, so a large 3PL. And we worked on a pricing model, I don't know, 8 months ago. I said, hey, flip me that pricing model back. And I just want to input these two different gas prices and see what that does to overall cost relative to rent. And so for his particular model, you know, a 500-mile trip, they'd allocated about $12 in real estate cost to that trip. Well, that incremental $1.50 a gallon added $120 of expense to that same, you know, trip, essentially that price they were going to quote a customer. So essentially what the punchline there is that your gas prices, the incremental increase was 10x what you're paying for your real estate. So that's where we say the value of the term we use is geographic leverage, i.e. having those boxes in the right places to maximize that proximity to the customer, and the efficiency of that supply chain is disproportionately high when pricing does what it does. And you see the same type of leverage even on the, you know, what other factors does that impact is the other one I brought up was labor availability. Like, you know, what is that commute time that someone's going to be willing to make when gas prices are $1.75 versus $4 a gallon? It's a very different, you know, drive radius that they're willing to do.
I think it's an amazing statistic, and I think it speaks to why so many people are going into deep analytics on versus a renewal, say on one exit. They might be looking at all of these analytics on supply chain and transportation costs, just converting a couple of exits down the freeway in the same market for the first time, right? It could be a substantial difference, right?
Yeah. It's you know, that's the line that I dropped in there. It's on my LinkedIn. It's one of my favorite quotes. The most dangerous thing in business is finding the right answer to the wrong question, right? So saving another 2 or 3 cents, you know, beating up another 2 or 3 cents a foot if you're not in the right location, you know, again, that's great, but you found the right answer to the wrong question.
Yeah. And Jason, I'd say, I know you touched quite a bit on system constraints, which I was concerned about. I certainly know about we all know about the labor component of that, but tell us where we're at right now, because we had so many consistent constraints through COVID. I think most people think we're getting out of it. Are we? Where are we?
Yeah, so the Census Bureau tracks data on this, and even though there's been a lot of discussion of supply chain related constraints easing, and typically when folks say that, they're really talking raw material issues, they don't really appear to be. You know, through the second quarter of this year, we were essentially have been unchanged going back a year in terms of the percentage of manufacturers citing these issues. And if you look, it's across sectors. It's chemical manufacturing, it's machinery manufacturers, it's transportation equipment manufacturers, so motor vehicles. We're still seeing, you know, over 40% of manufacturers in each of those sectors are saying we are operating below our target capacity utilization because of a shortage of raw materials. And given, we've talked about it with the, geopolitical risk, the disruption with the war in Ukraine, exacerbating these issues that already existed, it seems that it's a little optimistic right now to say things are getting substantially better.
Mm-hmm.
They may not be getting worse, but we're looking for, I'd say, at least another 9 months to a year until we can be back to maybe sort of 2018-ish levels of, material shortage issues.
There is light at the end of the tunnel.
There's a little light, but it's still going to take quite a while right now.
Yeah, Jason, on the the industrial sector has been so active over the last few years, and we're seeing a lot of new innovations and trends with warehouses. What are some trends that you're seeing in the warehousing space?
So, I think when you look at, again, sort of what the data is really providing us is a sense of, one, just how profound the change of the U.S. warehousing footprint has been over the last decade. The average number of individuals employed at a given warehouse has went from about 45 in 2012 up to 85 today. So it's practically doubled. And this is across the 21,000 different warehouses that are recognized in the United States right now. And so I think that speaks to you of just that increasingly important role of e-commerce, really driving warehousing growth, not to dismiss the more manufacturing-oriented manufacturing support side. And to tie back into Bret's conversation with, fuel prices, one of the first things we teach with network design is anytime transportation prices go up, your optimal decision is almost always to expand your distribution footprint, because that trade-off between facility cost and transportation costs now starts telling you add more facilities. And so I think as we've seen this increased push for warehousing space into more secondary and tertiary markets, we're not looking at fuel prices coming down anytime soon. U.S. refining capacity is about 4% below what it was pre-COVID. Our inventories of both diesel and gasoline are down, roughly 8-10% from where they were before COVID. We're exporting more products today than we've ever exported, given the situation in Europe. And so there's just no easy recipe to see fuel costs coming down anytime soon. And so that's one thing I would just encourage folks to be thinking about is if you're making any plans that transportation prices are going to be somehow coming down substantially in 23, I wouldn't get too excited about that, because there's not really any indicators that that's really the case.
So we're screwed on gas prices. Bret, how about labor? Don't tell us we're screwed there too. What's the outcome?
Yeah. It's the outlook's tough, because I think, we're in a persistent labor shortage from now on, but for, obviously massive downturn, there's going to be some slack in the immediate term. But one thing we look at there is we call it the 2060 differential. And I showed the graph in that room, but essentially on one axis, you've got the percent increase or change in the size of the labor market. On the other axis, you've got the percentage difference between the number of 20-somethings and the number of 60-somethings in the market. So, you go in the 70s and 80s, you're essentially at 120% more 20-somethings than you were 60-somethings. So way more 20-somethings than 60-somethings. Well, you fast forward to today, that 120% is now like 15, 20, rapidly approaching 10%. So essentially, you're looking at a flat labor pool, or almost like a labor carousel, right? Think of it, you got the 60-somethings pushing out, you got the 20-somethings coming in, and there are actually more people born between 52 and 61 than there were between 92 and 01. So we're in my opinion, a persistent labor shortage from now on. And obviously, you got a lot of things taking place on the automation side, both across the manufacturing sector as well as the distribution. But I think it's going to be, and I think, as technology continues to advance, it's a little bit more of a white collar conversation, but the value of top end labor, it's nonlinear, right? So as the world gets more and more complex and technology becomes a bigger deal, fewer and fewer people are frankly contributing more of the value in the world. If you look at that, historically, go back to take a 1,000-year view. So what that looks like going forward, I think the criticality of having best-in-class labor is going to continue to reign supreme.
Yeah, that's interesting, because that's why China's starting to struggle, right? Same thing. They're aging out, and they have the one-child policy, right? And Mexico, on the flip side of that, has the youngest workforce recorded, right? Has become our number one trade partners since 2018, and probably will be our number one trade partner for the rest of our lives.
Yep. Yeah, and if you look at like the war in Ukraine with like what Putin's doing, they're facing demographic collapse as well.
Mhm.
So, I think demographics are a very understood, probably a better way to put that, but an understood component of I'll call it the world and the way that the economy functions, just because, the quote, this is not an original quote, but it takes 18 years to make an 18-year-old, right? So you kind of know what's coming, if you will, and it's a little bleak for a lot of the developed world, and we're in a much better spot than Europe, but yeah, Mexico is going to be a massive, massive buoy, and we're lucky to have them as our trade
Absolutely.
partner, so.
Yeah. No. Well, this has been great, guys. I feel smarter already just from having you guys on this.
You look
but,
smarter, Bill.
I do. Yeah, I feel smarter. The other thing I will just say is it'll be interesting to see 5, 7, 10 years from now how the inside of warehouses look from a robotics standpoint. Who all is adapting to that? I mean, it's already happening, right? And so with the shortage of labor, that's another answer. Takes a big investment though, but
Yeah. To that, I was just going to pile on there. I think to that point, another thing is just like, it's interesting to watch the way that the capital market shifting is going to impact some of this stuff, because now all of a sudden the cost of capital for that automation is very different than it was, 3 months ago.
Sure is.
So to see that decision, and then also look at that risk calculus of, what do we own versus what do we lease? And if we're going to be putting all this capital into these buildings, should we be owning them? And then if we're going to own them, which ones do we own and where? And the way that analytics we're starting to see that transform that decision process on behalf of users, I think is a very, very interesting.
Yeah, no, it'll be interesting to be a part of.
Yeah,
I'm excited
no doubt.
for it. So, thank you guys for joining us. I know that the session you guys were just in went really well. A lot of good feedback, and so appreciate you guys joining us on our podcast. And we'll have a great rest of the conference.
Thanks, guys.
Of course, appreciate the opportunity.
Yep, thanks.